Thanks, Rachel. I don't know if you've noticed, but in a highly mobile culture like ours, in which upward mobility is not only expected, but in one sense, kind of a sacred duty, we read a passage like this, what Paul actually writes, and it doesn't receive an easy hearing, doesn't it? On the one hand, at least on the surface, when you hear these words, and even when I actually was preparing for this message, when you hear these words, there's something about it almost seems naive at best, and perhaps even infuriating at most. And I wonder if it might have been that way actually when the church in Corinth also heard these words. Well, if you've been coming for the past number of months, you know that we're going through a series with Paul's letter to the church in Corinth. And one of the things that we've seen from the onset is that Corinth was very much a status-hungry culture. Like most cosmopolitan Greece, it was driven between the haves and have-nots. It was a culture ultimately that a substantial segment of the population that was enslaved, at least economically they were. In short, Corinth was a highly stratified society. You always knew your place in Corinth because it was embedded in the culture. You knew where you stood. And there was clear identity markers that defined in terms of where you would fit in the larger society. And it was a culture where if you had the possibility, if you did, if you had the possibility, it would be very natural to pursue what it had to offer. Things like wealth, privilege, prosperity, and above all things, honor. You see, in the Roman culture, which Corinth was a part of, it wasn't enough just to be a somebody. You needed to be seen as a somebody. And so in that city, what actually ended up happening is public boasting and self-promotion was elevated almost to an art form. But when we think of that, we ask ourselves the question, isn't that the mark of our culture? Isn't that the mark of every culture? Doesn't every culture elevate certain status markers that almost compels us to pursue and gives us other status markers that we should avoid above all things, certain identity markers? And so we see that actually here. That's different for different cultures, yeah, for sure. Maybe it's the neighborhood you live in or the postal code. Maybe it's the credit card that you use. Maybe it's whether you're married or whether you're single, whether you have children or no children. Maybe it's the vacation spots and recreation places you have access to, or the memberships and associations that you have. Maybe it's the wealth and the investments that are yours, or the friends you have, or the social presence and influence that you have, the causes that you're a part of, the travel destinations that you go to, the kind of education and schools you go to, or the marks that you get. But aren't these, when we strip them away, just a way to both tell ourselves and the world that we've made something of ourselves? And so when you hear someone say to you, remain in the situation you're in, when you don't have those status markers, it may sound like the very thing that we fear, right? Stay put, stay where you are, don't rock the boat, don't seek and accept your condition you're in. And so we ask ourselves the question, who in their right mind would accept status quo in a culture that's driven by ambition, in a culture that's driven by opportunity, where there is an opportunity to make a name for yourselves, there is an opportunity to advance in everything that you do? Now, if we're honest, at least on the surface, what Paul seems to say here sounds a little bit silly, if not scandalous, not just to the Corinthian culture, but to our own culture as well, at least on the surface. Yet Paul says something more here. He says something about what happened to the Corinthians that they had seemed to have forgotten or not fully understood. But he's also saying something to us about something that's happened to us that perhaps we have not fully understood as well. You see, he says it 3 times, remain as you are. In verse 17, let each one live his life in the situation the Lord assigned. And then verse 20, let each of you remain in the situation. And then in verse 24, each person is to remain in the situation. 3 times, he's getting that point across. But notice he always qualifies it. There's always a qualifying word that he uses. And of course, that word he uses is the word called. In fact, he uses it 8 times in 8 verses. Remain in the situation you are called. Live in the situation and you were called. And so one of the things that he's trying to get us to understand is the connection between those two. The connection between being called and being in a situation, whatever the life situation or circumstance or condition that you are in today. And so here's his main point. I'm going to give you his thesis, and then we're going to unpack it. When God truly calls us to himself, that call is so decisive that it not only changes us, it changes how we view our life situation. God's call, when he calls us to himself to be his, it not only changes us, but it changes how we ought to view every life situation we might find ourselves in. So let's unpack that. The first thing we see is that God's call makes every worldly status marker less important. To understand what Paul is getting at, we need to first understand in terms of why we do it. Why do we pursue these cultural status markers in the first place? How often have you been tempted to say, or you've heard someone say, if only? Now, that might be different. If only my situation was different. If only I was able to get or have, name it, whatever actually it may be. Or until my circumstances change, my life does not really count. What things do you have to have in your own life? You must have it. Every culture, including ours, is always telling us, rebrand yourself, invent yourself. It's telling us actually, upgrade your status. So if you're single, you can feel like your life hasn't really begun. If you're married and you're disappointed, maybe you kind of feel like it's not what you expected. If you're in a low-paying job or a stigmatized role, maybe you feel invisible. It could be different things for each of us, but the message is relentless. Change your status or you're nobody. It may be different for different people, as I mentioned, but in the end, it's a desire for a bottom line. And I want to suggest to you that what Paul is telling us is that every one of us in this room has a bottom line. And one of the ways that we know that, and he's going to use a word throughout the letters of Corinthians, is what are the things that you're tempted to boast about when you have them? The things that you're tempted to boast about. It's not coincidental that more than any other church, more than any other letters, he uses that word boast. 36 times. There's nothing even close to it. It's a boasting culture. It's a statusing culture. And so you would expect in a statusing culture, there's things to boast about. But when we think of the word boast, what comes into your mind? Bragging, arrogance. But in the Bible, the word boasting is much stronger than that. It's not simply that. At the end of the first chapter, Paul quotes Jeremiah chapter 9, but he only quotes the end of it. But he wants us to understand what the context is, and in that context, Jeremiah says these words. He says, "Let not the wise boast in their wisdom, let not the strong boast in their might, let not the rich boast of their riches." What's he describing? It's a person who says, I am something, I'm not nothing, I'm not a nobody. I'm something, I matter because of this. Could be wisdom, could be might, could be power, could be riches, could be influence. That's the very thing that gives you the status. And Paul is concerned that the status-seeking tendency is beginning to seep into the church, as well as it is in our own day as well. Now, where do we see that? He gives us two illustrations. One's more religious, and the other one's more economic. The first one is found in verse 18 and 19. And when you read it, you think, what's he talking about? Was anyone already circumcised when he was called? He should not undo his circumcision. Was anyone called while uncircumcised? He should not get circumcised. Circumcision does not matter, and uncircumcision does not matter. He's giving us a picture of identity markers because in that culture, and this was the thing that he wrestled with, that if you became a Christian, there was a thinking and there was a philosophy, especially with a lot of the Jewish Christians, that if you really want to become a Christian, it wasn't enough just to believe in Jesus. You needed to accept the sign of that relationship, which back in the Old Testament was circumcision. So for your life to really, really count, for you really to be spiritual, circumcision is part of you being faithful. It's part of ultimately you being actually someone who adheres to what God has said in the Old Testament. So the Christian church was birthed out of that. But yet here he's saying that none of those things matter. Now we can read that and we can look at that and say that's an interesting historical curiosity. It's a good thing that we don't wrestle with that anymore. That's not an issue that we deal with. But I want to suggest to you that it is, but it looks a little bit different. That we have our own way of doing that even today. How often do we actually say to someone, if you really want to make a difference, if you really want your life to count, then you need to go into the ministry. You need to become a pastor, a missionary. You need to be part of a Christian organization. That if you really want your life to make a difference, that's what you need to be able to do. Now, these are noble callings, and if God's calling you to do that, you should do that for sure. But what Paul is basically saying is that has no bearing on your status before who God is. None whatsoever. God can work in any context, including the one that you are in now. And so one of the things that we need to be aware of is not tell necessarily people who become new Christians, you need to leave what you're doing and you need to go into Christian ministry work as if the things and the context you're currently in cannot be that. It cannot be the place where God is actually working in and through their lives. He's implying that there's no ideal situation. There's no ultimate situation that's the ideal one where God could be at work in your life. So don't let it trouble you. Paul's not saying we should never pursue change or better ourselves or take opportunities that are presented to us. He's not telling us that. He's not telling us simply just to keep status quo for status quo's sake. Rather, his point is he's getting us to ask the question is, if there is change that you want, what's the motivation behind it? What are you pursuing? Why are you pursuing it? What do you hope to get out of that? There's no need to be restless and anxious when it comes to God at work in your own life, is what he's trying to tell us. So we see this in the second illustration. He says, were you called while a slave? Don't let it concern you. Now, maybe that's a little bit shocking to us. Now, remember that slavery is not the slavery that we think about in the 18th, 19th, 20th century in different places around the world. It was people who were, in one sense, that just obviously needed economic opportunities, and you tended to work for a patron, somebody who provided for your needs. So it didn't have the same connotation that we have necessarily today. He's telling the Christians, don't worry about whether you're a slave or not. Don't worry about your low economic status or culture status or the presumed spiritual negativity which is implied by it. In other words, despite what our culture tells us, there's no need to elevate one life situation over against another. But now there's a need to actually minimize one life situation over another. If you find opportunities to better yourself, fantastic. But don't put a lot of stock into that. Don't think, what he's saying is, now my status is different. Whatever it may be, whatever the success is that the world provides for us. He's not saying be embarrassed by it. He's just basically saying is don't put more stock on it than it's warranted. But on the other hand, he's saying there's no justification to denigrate other life situations. He's saying we must never say, I'm just whatever it may be. I'm just a student. I'm just a stay-at-home parent. I'm just a janitor. I'm just a tradesperson. I just have a high school degree. He's saying when we do that, we're playing into the culture and status markers that our world is actually giving us, and there's no justification and a warrant for it. In fact, he reminds them of their worldly status when he first called them to himself. It's found in chapter 1 of 1 Corinthians. He says this, brothers and sisters, consider your calling. Not many were wise from a human perspective, not many powerful, not many of noble birth, but God has chosen what is insignificant and despised in the world, what is viewed as nothing, to bring to nothing what is viewed as something, so that no one may boast in its presence. What does he tell them? When I called you, you had no worldly status. You had no cultural cachet. You weren't somebody's at that point. And that was part of the point. He's not saying that really that what God really wants is nobodies. He's not interested in somebodies. But what he's saying is the very things that we define our lives by, the statuses we define our lives by, really don't mean much. Don't accept those terms. They matter. They have very, very little significance to him. Now, why would that be? Why would God's call make every worldly status matter less? And that's the second point. Because secondly, his call highlights the only status that truly matters. Now look what he says. For he is called by the Lord as a slave is the Lord's freedman. Likewise, he is called as a free man as Christ's. You were bought at a price. What he's saying is this. He's saying when God called them, when God calls you, he's given you the ultimate freedom from every status marker, regardless of the situation and circumstance, even slavery. And so it's quite, in one sense, an incredible claim that he's making here. When he says you've been bought with a price, his audience would immediately understood what he's referring to. It's a language of redeeming a slave. He's saying you've been redeemed, whether you're a literal slave or not. You've been redeemed. I've liberated you. I freed you from all the things the world tells you must have to be a somebody. And the reason for that is somebody has purchased your freedom from that. How do you know the value of something? How do you know what something is worth? I'll tell you one of the ways. By that by which you're willing to pay to get it. You're not only willing, but you're willing to pay the price to be able to get it. And so what was God willing to pay to have you? Paul's going to tell us in one of those breathtaking chapters in the Bible, in Romans chapter 8, he says these words. If God is for us, who is against us? He did not even spare his own son, but gave him up for us all. Now, many biblical scholars say when Paul says these words, that what he has in the back of his mind is the story of Abraham. If you know the story of Abraham, that Abraham was willing to basically not only give up, but sacrifice the greatest worldly treasure that he had, his son Isaac, as a demonstration of his love towards God. And yet, what do we see? What's Paul's point here is, that's exactly what God did. That God himself was willing to give up his greatest heavenly treasure, his one and only son, as a demonstration of his love towards us. But there's one difference. Abraham didn't need to give up. He just needed to be willing. He got his actual son back. But God did. And so it tells us at least this, that God will never offer you that which costs him nothing. It cost him everything. It cost him the greatest treasure that there is. The righteous for the unrighteous to bring you to God. That's the price that he actually paid. That's why he says, ultimately, over and over again, that this is the reason and this is the greatest expression of love the world has ever known. He's bought you. He's purchased you. We saw that in chapter 16 or chapter 6, verse 20. It says, "For you were bought at a price. You are not your own." You don't belong to the world. You don't belong to the cultural status markers. You belong to another. And that's why he says he who's called you as a free man is Christ's slave. Don't become slaves of people. In other words, how can you become slaves of other people's expectations, other people's, what they want you to do, ultimately when God has bought you and brought you to himself through Christ? The American singer Bob Dylan had a song a number of years ago on the Slow Train Coming, and the lyrics, if we had more time, I'd go through the lyrics with you, but here's the title of it, "You Gotta Serve Somebody." And he goes through that. Whether it be the devil or the God, you gotta serve somebody, and that's the constant refrain. He's telling us that there is no option. Every one of us now, whoever you are, whatever your background, is serving somebody, something in their lives. There is no place of neutrality. but he's also telling us that there is a master whose service to him is freedom. Now, how is that possible? How is it possible to be a servant and slave of someone and to recognize that that's ultimate freedom? It sounds paradoxical, doesn't it? And it's because of this. Everything our culture tells us we have to be recognized, to be valued, to be made beautiful, to be somebody. What if, when God has called you and when you put your trust in him and what Jesus has done for you, he's already given that to you? Not as something that you've acquired, but something that's been given ultimately as a gift of free grace to you, a gift that can never be taken away. Why pursue worldly status markers when you're given the ultimate one as a gift? Now, when Paul says he did not spare his one and only son, but gave him up for us freely, he doesn't end there. If you know what the next verse is, he says this: how will he not also grant us everything? Now, when we hear that word, we may actually literally read it and just think, okay, that's hyperbole, exaggeration. Surely he's exaggerating. What do you mean everything? Like it's I'm a child of God and you've come into my life and I have a spiritual encounter with him and I have a relationship with him. But what about all the other stuff in life? But he's already told us in chapter 3, at the end of chapter 3, what he means by that. And what he means is what he says. And in fact, he actually says it again in chapter 3. He says this: let no one boast in human leaders, for everything is yours. The world or life or death or the present or the things to come, everything is yours. And you belong to Christ, and Christ belongs to you. In Romans, he says, if you're a child of God, you are an heir of God, and you're a co-heir with Christ. How's that for status? If you're going to boast about that. That's the ultimate status marker that he gives to those as a free act of grace and nothing more. And so we see that here. He wants us to boast, but he wants us to boast in the thing that is ultimately worthy of that boasting. And that's why he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 31, let him who boasts, boast in the Lord and what he has done. Let him glory in that. Let him find his identity and security and hope and joy in that and what has been done for him and not what he does for him. And so Jesus is saying, I'm the kind of master that will never crush you. I will never oppress you. If you have me, I will fulfill you. And if you fail me, I'll forgive you. I'm the only master that can give you that's my service, your service to me, is complete freedom. So that's why he's saying is, you can be content in whatever the situation is in, because you already have what the world is pursuing. If you have me, you will have that. So friends, tomorrow morning, each of us is going to go to a different life situation. It may be to an office. It may be to a shop. It may be to a school classroom. It may be to a neighborhood or to a home. And so how does this relate to that? How does what you do tomorrow morning when you actually wake up, what difference does it make? How can you practice this? And the last point is going to help us with that. You see, God's call doesn't just make every worldly status marker less important. It doesn't just highlight the only status that truly matters. Lastly and thirdly, God's call secures our status in every situation. Verse 24, each person is to remain with God in a situation he was called. Here's what he's saying. Wherever you find yourself tomorrow, there remain with God. Now, the key word there, of course, the key words in that passage is with God. And there's different ways of translating and understanding that. It literally actually means is before or alongside God. And it could be translated in the presence of God. And it means this, that you never, ever, ever do anything alone. You never do anything alone. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, wherever you find yourself, you're never in a situation alone. Think about that. Because if you're anything like me, I realize there's times where I live like a functional atheist, where I'm in situations and circumstances, whether it be work, and it's like I'm not even aware that God is with me in that. oblivious to it. What about you? That we mindlessly go through certain kinds of things and we just think that although we're called by God, we don't put that into practice. It's not a reality in our lives. We walk around as if like anybody else. There's no difference whatsoever. You never go to work alone. You never go to school alone. And it's saying that Jesus takes the situations that we're tempted either to despise because it seems so hard and difficult, or idolize because it seems, in one sense, like it's so great. And he tells us that these are the places, ultimately, that were designed by him for us to meet him and serve him. Paul tells us, ultimately, that his concern is not with change per se, whether you change your circumstances or not change your circumstances. He says that's ultimately irrelevant. He's saying live out your call wherever it is. Today, whatever you're doing, live out your call and what he calls your marital status, whether you're single, whether you're widowed, whether you're divorced, whatever it may be. Live out your call in wherever he's called you. Your economic status, whether being well-to-do or not well-to-do, live out your call. Whether blue-collar or white-collar work, whether it's high school or university or public school or whatever, or homeschool, whatever it may be, wherever we find ourselves in places not of our own choosing, maybe perhaps, but to realize that if God is with us, we can relax. We can relax. God's called you in a particular life situation. It may not be forever where he's assigned to you, but while it is today, bloom where you're planted. Bloom where he's placed you as well. And when you do, you'll find this, is not only that God begins to change your life and transform it, over time he begins to change the very place and the condition, the situation where you find yourself. He begins to transform it. When God wants to change an area of our lives or areas of our society, what does he do? He calls someone in that. If you're called to be a lawyer, for instance, God's called you while in law school, then that's the place where he wants you to serve him and express your service to him. This is true of every area. If you're an engineer, if you're a mechanic, if you're a teacher, whether it be education or politics or wherever it may be, God begins to, first of all, call people from those specific areas. And he begins to transform it from the inside out. And some of you know that. You've experienced that. You've seen that takes place. And it means that every area, every situation has significance, not because it's significant in itself, but it's because it's the arena of which God is doing some of his best work and the best work that he wants to do. I want to suggest to you, just in closing, that this is true not only of your personal life. This is the way that God has designed and works not only in our lives, but in our cities and our world as well. And this is the way he is doing it today, by the way. For those who have eyes to see, he's doing it today. So let me give you an end with a world life or real world example. This is happening in the world right now. It's happening in a very unlikely place. Mission researchers tell us that the fastest growing church movement globally, and it's not even close, by the way, with an estimated annual growth rate of 20% year after year over the past couple of decades, is happening right now in an unlikely place, in Iran. And we prayed for that God would do miracles. And I would suggest to you, God is doing miracles in Iran. In 1979, the estimates were that there was just a few hundred Christians in that place. What's the significance of 1979? That was the beginning of the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And during that period of time, all mission organizations were expelled. That you couldn't actually do any evangelism, proselytization. It was banned by the Islamic regime. And so many people basically says, well, that's the end of Christianity. It's like we got no missionaries. You got no people actually that are being sent there. But our constraints are not God's constraints. Our limitations are not God's limitations. Did you know that today there's over 1 million Christians in Iran? The fastest growing religion right now, the Christian movement around the globe, is in Iran. And how did he do it if there's no missionaries actually there? You know how he did it? He began to call people from different segments of society. And they began to realize, whether it be doctors or lawyers or teachers or whoever else it may be throughout society, God says, I want to transform this nation, and I'm going to do it just through people, I don't care what their life situation is. I don't care in terms of the fact that there might be difficulties and challenges. Not that he doesn't care about the difficulties and challenges, but he's not limited by that. He doesn't work just in favorable and ideal, what we think are favorable and ideal conditions. His limitations are not our limitations. And we see it actually today that it's primarily through these underground churches, through average Christians, through Christians like you and me. Ones perhaps, that aren't official missionaries, they're not official pastors or evangelists. They're people who just simply work. And we see actually how he's spreading that there's more Christians that have become Christians in the past 20 years in Iran than the previous 1,300. Previous 1,300, with all the missionary movements and all the things that were done, God's decided, I'm going to do this. The time is right. And he's doing it through people that when they become Christians, their options are very, very limited. They have to remain in the situation that God has actually called them. And yet God is using that through the faithful joy and contentment of his followers in every sphere of life to transform a nation from the inside out. You want to know what the second fastest church growth movement is right now? Afghanistan. Do you know who it's primarily from? Iranian workers. You see what God is actually doing? Friends, this is nothing new, by the way. This is always actually how God has worked. This is true of even the first 3 centuries. How did God start this movement? It was through people like me and you, artisans and people in terms of their neighborhoods and their friends and their family. And if God is going to do something in our society, in our city, in our culture, it's going to be through individuals like you and me, whatever calling you have, whatever life situation that you're in right now, that God is going to work in and through you. That you're going to be able to see that, not only that he has called you, but he has a reason and a purpose for where he has put you. That's what Paul is getting at. That's why he's saying relax. Relax. There's nothing wrong with change, but understand why, what are you pursuing? Why the change? If you have the opportunity, it's great. He's not denigrating, whether it be actually to have PhDs or living in affluent neighborhoods or any of those kinds of things. He's saying recognize that those are great contexts to be able to reach others as well. Don't put your status in that. That's not who you are. You've been freed from those kinds of things. So use it. Use it in the way ultimately that he would actually have to use it. Because it matters less of where you are and the conditions you are. What matters most is who you're with or who's with you. Friends, if you understand what he's done for you when God called you, then you're going to be free to sit loose to everything in this world because you already have the ultimate status markers that matters most. You're his. You're called to him. And if you're his, it means you're an heir of God and a co-heir with Jesus Christ. Let's pray. Father, we so often are slow to learn the things that you actually tell us in your words. And yet we're so shaped and formed by our culture that a lot of times they come across as foreign. And yet, there is good news here. To get off the treadmill, when our hearts are full of anxiety and worry, when we always feel like we're falling short, we're just keeping the status we have seems so difficult. And yet here we have perfect freedom, perfect liberation. That no matter what may come our way, no matter what situation that we might find ourselves in, that we can say it as well with my soul. Because the one who has called us will complete what he began, this great work. And not only in our lives, but through our lives, in whatever sphere, whatever condition, situation we find ourselves in. And so, Father, I pray that you would help us, even Monday morning, to begin to apply the truths that are found in your word that become more of a reality in our own lives. And now as we partake of this Lord's Supper, that it would give us the strength and the resolve to live that way, not just in our minds, but in our hearts. What might that look like in the eyes of the world? That when we live that way, that would provoke people to say, how do you do it? How do you do it? And give us an opportunity to point people to Jesus Christ and him as the answer to all. We pray this in his name. Amen.